Okay, so this morning I've got Cheryl Thorpe. Um, Cheryl's a dear friend. She's worked with Mary for, I don't know, a long, long time. And Cheryl has absolutely the worst COVID story of anyone we know who has survived. Um, it's astounding. And so rather than I've thought a lot about this, Cheryl. I'd like to be able to help people with things. There's a little bit of an indictment on the medical system right now that people should know, but I think just being able to tell your story along the way, people will pick up. They'll understand those other things, but people need to tell their story. So I don't know. I'll introduce this, but then I need you to talk a whole lot. So you you had just finished a round of chemo, and those are always brutal. And your daughter tested positive.
Yes, from her exposure to her volleyball team. She tested positive. When she tested positive, I tested negative, but 3 days I knew I had symptoms and went back and I tested positive.
So you tested negative the first time. So right,
Correct.
and
Mhm.
then the symptoms are undeniable, and you go back and you test positive. Um, I am going to break for a second. We assume it's the volleyball team, but as I've tried to explain, even with masks, there's enough virus floating around. You don't ever know. I know other kids got it on the ball, whatever. It doesn't matter because what happens to us as humans is we start blaming ourselves too. We start going, oh, if only I hadn't let her do that. If don't do that to yourself. Okay. She's a senior in high school. This is a big part of her life. We don't know. We don't know.
Right.
So anyway, you tested positive. We never really knew how bad the symptoms were in that first stage for you and her. How were things at home?
The first time for us was not awful. Neither one of us ran a fever at all. We both had a lot of congestion, coughing, headaches, pretty bad headaches, and we were both incredibly tired. And, Taylor has an incredible schedule year round. And there were a number of days where she slept between 15 and 18 hours. Um, so she was just completely exhausted. Um, and I would say it's the same for me, just having finished chemo and a surgery as well. I don't really think mine were a whole lot worse. Mine was just the fatigue and just incredible tiredness. Some body aches also, some flu-like body aches.
You can't you can't really describe the fatigue. I don't know if you had this. I had times I wasn't sure if I was awake or asleep.
That is, yes, absolutely. Um, Absolutely. It was obviously much worse a little bit later on, but the first time around, it was really bad.
All right, so you talk about first time around, and briefly, I'm going to say it's because at one point, and we'll get to this, but they speculated that you may have been one of three people or something who got it twice.
That's correct. And
I think
that,
I think that's
yeah,
silly. Okay, I'm just going to tell you, I think that's silly. People don't get it twice. It's just that you don't get over it, and it's part of what the medical system. I mean, there is a scientific method, and they a lot of times have just abandoned it. They're just taking a shotgun approach. So anyway, but you got to feeling better, and then you started feeling worse. Correct?
yes. Well, I was feeling better, yes. And my oncologist said that I had to go and get tested again before he would administer my in September. I had to test negative and show proof of a negative test. So I went back to Texas Negative and then the positive test, and then I tested negative. So that it had been about 30 days from my original positive test, and I actually tested. At that point, I also asked them if I could get a flu shot, because I know as a cancer patient, that's something that they always want me to do every year, is get a flu shot. And so since I tested negative, they said yes, they would give me the flu shot. Then I had chemo next day, and it was a all day treatment. Um, Within 48 hours of that chemo treatment, I was running 104.5-degree temperature.
Okay. That's 104 and a half.
And as a cancer patient, for the past 10 years, I have always been told that at 100.3, I need to call the oncologist, probably be heading to the emergency room. So that's a substantial difference from 3. And obviously, the way your body reacts, the way you feel, everything is just awful at that point.
So you went to the hospital with 104.3, is that right?
At that point, no, I called my oncologist and his med clinic to see what their take on it was. And they said, we just think that maybe you are having some flu symptoms, even though it's a dead virus that, that we gave you, we think it's the flu. So let's just treat it as the flu right now. And every 4 hours, take Tylenol, et cetera, to help with the fever. And I knew that within 3 days or so of that, that it was way worse than that. And I mean, running that kind of high fever for that long a time at that point to me was very, very alarming.
Yeah.
And um, lo and behold, it ended up lasting for, 6 or 7 weeks. So the fever high. But I called my oncologist back, and they said that I needed to go to the hospital at that point. So I went to the first hospital that is close by my house. And as I was in the ER, they were treating me for sepsis, because of knowing that I was going through chemo, and I had just had chemo a few days before. But they also knew that I had COVID in August, that I had tested positive, but that I had also then tested negative, that I should have been recovered from it.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Absolutely.
So that last test that came back negative, was that the rapid response test?
It was one of the ones where they basically put the swab up in your brain.
But how long did it take to get the response back?
It was rapid, yes.
I'm sorry, it was what?
It was a rapid test. So I got it back within 10 or 15 minutes or so.
I just so you know, we're getting some internet delays on your end, and so I'm if it gets bad enough, we may have to try and do this again. But right now, it is on the edge of tolerable, so let's tolerate. That's why I didn't understand you. So it was a rapid test, and I'm gonna interject myself into this. The rapid response test is worthless, absolutely, utterly worthless. And the problem, and see, I used to teach this, mine were computers, but the process is the same. The diagnostic process should be the same. And when you start with a bad assumption, you come to a bad conclusion. And that test is yielding so many false negatives and false positives that you can't make a diagnostic conclusion off of it. You take it, and if it's right, then it's right. But you don't know if it's right. There's the problem. You don't know. And if you don't know, what you have is nothing diagnostic. And so I'm convinced that part of this next phase of your ordeal is because they took a worthless test and applied it as if it was gospel truth, and then began making a whole bunch of treatment decisions on bad information. So pardon me, go ahead. You're now, if we can remember where you were, let's get back to it.
Sure. I was there in the emergency room. close to my house. And when the COVID test came back, basically all the great treatment that I had from the ER nurse, all of that stuff completely shut down. I had a horrible, horrible headache. I had a high fever and could not get anybody to come back into the room to me to tell me even what was going on. I was in there for hours, probably about 6 hours, 6 hours. And then finally, somebody came in and said, your COVID test is positive, and we're trying to find a hospital that will accept you. These are some of the choices. And I told them at that time that it had to be University Hospital, which is where my oncologist has his privileges. And so then they left with that information and came back probably another couple of hours later to tell me that they were transferring me to a different hospital. And I told them that was not going to happen. They were administering some antibiotic and fluids, probably two different antibiotics and some fluids at that time. And I told them that I was absolutely not transferring to this other hospital, not knowing any doctors, them not knowing me or my history. And I said, as soon as all of the fluids and the medicine were done being administered, that I was checking myself out of the hospital and going home. And they made me sign extra paper that it was against medical advice that I was doing that. And I told them that I understood and that my oncologist would help me figure out how I could stay under his care. And I would deal with that in the morning,
Okay, so
which,
again, this is a good place. I'm going to break in one more time because we were able to keep in contact with you via cell, and during that time, you were talking to Mary.
yes.
So you were there. Uh, they believe they took that first negative test, and they said, "Okay, she doesn't have COVID." And I mean, they were thinking, "Okay, how about your trip to Africa or Guatemala or whatever?" Right? They're just they're grasping at straws, and you're telling them, "No, I haven't been out of the country. No, it's none of those things." And they're but this is what they're doing. So they're looking in the weeds rather than look at the obvious. And then when the next test comes back positive, then they just abandoned you in place.
Mhm.
You couldn't get anyone to speak to you. Were you not yelling down the halls and stuff, trying to get someone to tell her something? I remember these stories from you, and we're just, we're almost frantic on our end because ordinarily we would have driven up there to advocate for you, but they won't let other humans in. They won't let family member or friends. You have no advocate, correct?
That's absolutely right. This was the first hospital though, so it wasn't. It was definitely that I was abandoned and that they did not. They had no intention of doing anything other than continuing to run the things in my IV that were in place, and then I was going to be sent by ambulance to another hospital.
Someday,
Um,
sometime, somewhere. But you were there a long time, Cheryl. We were.
mhm,
I mean, you're just sitting there, and you're got 104 plus fever for what seemed like already a long time,
mhm.
and they just won't even speak to you. And I'm going to tell you this, and then I'm going to let you go back again. But checking yourself out in the middle of the night while you're by yourself and with those kind of symptoms and with the cancer situation that you have and everything else is one of the most courageous things.
Well, I was scared, frankly, at that point after having already been abandoned just in the ER, shortly after getting the COVID results. I was scared. There's no way I wanted to be shipped off to a hospital where nobody knew me. And
Yeah, but
um,
we're conditioned that when they tell you you need to stay here, we just won't do it. And I remember you saying that you're stuck here. No one knows if you died. No one would even know. I mean, they have nobody to get in touch with. Checking yourself out though in the middle of the night by yourself is still one of the most courageous things we've seen. So anyway, you check yourself out.
So the next morning, early the next morning, as soon as my oncologist office opened, I called them and they started getting to work on finding or getting a room for me at University Hospital. Um, and it was about noon. They called and said, okay, we have a room for you. This is where you need to go. So basically, I went straight, I no, I drove there again. I drove there because Taylor was in school. And I went immediately to the room that they had assigned to me, the direct admit that my office did. And I was probably in there for about 30 or 45 minutes. And then my nurse came in, and then I had a whole team of tons of people in the room. I mean, it was absolutely chaotic. There were probably 5 or 6 doctors, special phlebotomist that was using um, like a sonogram to find a good vein. Because they knew that I probably had COVID based on what the other hospital had said. I was going in under the presumption that I had COVID, but um, anyhow, everything was just absolutely insane with all the doctors and the nurses that were in there with me. And I would say probably within 8 or 10 hours, I was moved to the COVID unit there at the hospital. Um, the whole time, my symptoms, they're, I still have the super high fever, 104 plus, horrible diarrhea, running to the bathroom with the
Oh yeah.
IV pole and everything, nausea, terrible headache, just blinding headache. Um, and um, anyhow, just incredibly scared. But I still had my phone, I had my laptop and everything. I had ways to still communicate, definitely communicating with Mary and communicating with my daughter about what was going on. Um, for the first week, I would say that I was there, I had incredible care. I had nurses that were traveling nurses that had already been through the hellacious stuff in New York. And I was very fortunate for probably 5 days in a row. I had a traveling nurse in the through the daytime 12-hour shift, and then also for the 12-hour shift through the evening. And like I got as best care as possible. They were advocating for me
Yes.
and saying, this is not working. We need better pain medicine. The Tylenol is not doing anything for her headache pain. It's also not bringing her fever down. We're having to do ice packs constantly all
Ice
over
pack.
her whole.
You just stayed in ice packs for whole days.
Yes, yes. Um, and then, but my body was also doing other weird stuff. When the fever would come down, then it would actually go down where my temperature was around 97 and I was freezing, but I was still sweating. I mean, my head was
Yeah.
soaking wet.
Yeah.
And I mean, my clothes, the hospital gown, the pajama bottoms, everything was completely soaking wet, but I was at 97 degrees instead, and I'm shaking and absolutely, I mean, it was like having a seizure almost with the amount of shaking that I was doing. But I
Did you
can't
sit and
tell.
make noises? Did you sit and groan and stuff from the
Absolutely.
That's why
Yeah.
I was so glad I was able to come over to this house, because Mary would not have done well with what it sounded like. I mean, you have no control over having to make the groans and stuff from the chills and sweats at the same time. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so here's a good point, and I need to make it. there are good people in the medical system, and there are people who are giving excellent care in places. And I don't want to discount that or impugn them. It is not the entire system. But what other people listening need to understand is there are also times, there are also places where there is terrible care. And you
Mhm.
have to be honest about that. And you have to recognize it to advocate for yourself. If you find yourself in one of these places where there is terrible care, you need to get out, even though you're scared that I need treatment and I need it now. Bad treatment may even be worse than no treatment. Get out and go find some place with these people who are actually very good. And you saw the difference between those two. It's night and day.
Absolutely. And FEMA pulled the plug, after 5 days or so of me having those two nurses. They said, oh, well, things are getting much better in San Antonio. The positivity rate has gone down so much. We have so many less people in the hospital. And we're taking these people are their contract is going away. And it was immediate. The quality of care after those people going away, it was immediate. They couldn't get enough nurses to cover the COVID patients that they had, and a lot of the ones that they had were scared to come into the room. It was obvious. One of the night nurses I had, which was probably one of the worst ones, said, I'm only allowed to come in here twice for a 12-hour shift. So basically, I needed to stop asking for help. I need to stop pushing my call button. And after going round and round with her, I told her that I did not want her back in my room, and I did not want her coming back to care for me at all. Um, and then the next morning, I had a charge nurse come in and visit with me for a while about that situation. And
Where,
I guess I was
go
there for
ahead.
probably another 4 weeks after that, and I never had that nurse again.
Good, good. This is one of the other points. Again, I'll people have to understand. Once a loved one is behind the walls of this COVID system, they are lost to you.
Mhm.
You cannot help them. And my 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 nature um, maybe is a little rough. I'm a fighter, and ordinarily, Cheryl, I would have gotten their attention. We would have driven up, and I would have turned up the volume to the point. I can be persuasive, and I would have gotten their attention, and things would have changed. But you cannot do that in this situation. Once your loved one has gone inside the walls of this COVID system, they are
Mhm.
lost to you.
Yeah, they wouldn't have let you pass the lobby.
I know they
I
would have had me arrested. I'm saying you can't
Yeah,
do it anymore. So,
yeah.
so as we have this sort of idea that this stuff can't happen, and if it does, someone comes in and shakes things up. There was a point there where, well, I shouldn't jump the gun. I need to let you tell this. But anyway, so the care changed. You're still there, but now all of a sudden the care is not good. Let's say what happened next.
They were taking so much blood and sending me for brain scans and full body CT scans, fully knowing that I am a cancer patient, and all of this radiation and everything that they're putting in my body
Yes.
could very easily create another cancer or cancers. Um, and they were at this point already, just a into a week or so into it, they're insistent that it's like they put the whole COVID thing behind us. It's got to be something other than COVID,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
are gonna you have to pee in a cup, poop in the thing. We're giving or taking so much blood from you around the clock. making you cough and spit into a cup, testing me for TB multiple times. It was over and over and over again. They were insistent that it was something other than COVID. Um,
And
and
it's like I remember this time for you. It's like some weird Joseph Mengele, hospital. They tell you what to do. And we're so conditioned once again that you don't understand what this disease does. People who haven't had it, it takes your will. It does a weird thing to your brain. I felt like, oh, well, anyway. So you're doing all these things and they're putting you in for scans. And you're right. I remember that time. They just sort of ruled out COVID now. And it's back to the idea of what about your trip to Africa? What about the all this stuff? And they're doing scans. And there was a point where they were about to send you in for yet another, I think maybe a brain scan. And again, you had the courage and you said, for what? What is this? What are you looking for? You've already done this scan at least
mhm,
once. I don't know how many they did, but I knew they'd done it already.
mhm.
Right? And you said, what are you looking for? And they couldn't tell you. And so you said, no, you're not doing this to me. And they don't expect that. They almost don't accept. You don't tell us no. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. I had a nurse and a doctor in my room at that time, and they're wanting to send me in for an emergency brain scan. And I said, it's been less than 48 hours since my last brain scan. What exactly do you think is been? What do you think you're going to find that wasn't already there for less than 48 hours ago? I can't keep having all of this radiation, and it doesn't make sense that something dramatic has changed. I have the same symptoms that I had then, but that was the night that my headache so bad, the pain was so bad, and I stopped being able to see out of my right eye. So that's what they're trying to say, that I all of a sudden have some disease in my eye, and they're going to have to do emergency surgery, and
They're going to do
that's what
emergency
that was.
surgery on your eye. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and I'm there for COVID, and I'm telling them at the same time, I think I'm dehydrated. I want you guys to give me fluids. I think my mouth, I can't even swallow. It's like I have cotton in my mouth. And everybody knows one of the first things of being dehydrated is that you get a terrible headache. And I want fluids, and they were very furious with me for refusing the brain scan, and very adamant that they were not going to give me fluids, with no explanation for why, just that they were not. They relented. They did not do the scan, and at some point later, probably within an hour or two of both the doctor and the nurse being in my room late that night, they came in and started a bag of fluids for me, but had it on such a low drip that it took 24 hours for the bag to be administered, which, I've been in lots of infusion rooms and been in the hospital a number of times. That's not ever what they do, but that's what they chose to do because they're thinking, I don't know, that I'm going to get over too much fluid in me. I don't know,
So,
but
so again, I hate to break in, but there's some points we need to make here.
mhm,
And one of them is in the internet age, and it's everyone's angry and people make a lot of claims and they're always mad. And so it's easy to dismiss. But I made a statement a minute ago that it's like a Dr. Mengele hospital. I meant what I said. You will comply. And they were doing these things to you, and they were because we're in contact with you. They're
mhm,
angry that you won't comply. And the idea, I can tell you, wasn't able to stay hydrated. I felt like something out of a horror movie where I just need to I can't get enough liquid in me, and it was never enough. And you're sitting there dehydrated, and they're telling you, no, we're not going to give you fluids. We're not
mhm.
going to give you fluids. People will think this can't happen in our medical system. It can't. It not only can happen, it did happen. It's horrific. The idea that they wouldn't give you fluids. And so when you finally insisted, they give you a bag that took 12 hours or 24.
24 hours before it finally finished.
That amount of fluid in that bag wasn't lasting me 20 minutes here at the house. I have this big ice chest that I was loaded with ice, and I'm filling it all night long, all day long, and you're sitting there in a hospital unable to get fluid until they finally give you one little pint bag lasting 24 hours. It's unconscionable.
It was one of the big, probably whatever. It's a big bag, but
Okay.
still
It's a big
over
bag.
24 hours.
It's a 3-pint bag. Okay.
Yeah.
But so now you've got an hour and a half worth of fluid in 24 hours. That's how long it would have lasted me, maybe. And this idea of they're going to do emergency surgery on your eye while you're in the middle of this. On top of everything else, now we're going to put you under general anesthesia and operate on your eye because you don't have enough trouble, right?
Yeah.
Somehow that's going to, it's astounding. By the way, they never operated on your eye, did they?
No.
No, and it must not have been much of an emergency because I can see your eye. I think you may have taken some damage. Yeah, but it was such an emergency that in the middle of a crisis, they're going to operate on your eyeball and look at you now. It must not have been much of an emergency. And if anyone else who sees this needs to understand that you better advocate for yourself because this can happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but some points had to get there.
Absolutely. No, the ophthalmologist had a whole different idea. Obviously, they came to see me the next day and they're like, yes, we do see that there's a bunch of pressure there, but you have COVID and we're not going to operate on you. So they did have a way different look at it. They're operating on people that really needed to have surgery, and they didn't want a COVID patient coming in and contaminating them and exposing their doctors also. I mean, there's that side of it, which I understand. And I didn't want to have surgery in the first place.
Well, yeah.
It's necessary.
Yeah. Elective eyeball surgery in the middle of a crisis. When did your eye begin leaking fluid?
It was probably about that time, probably about two weeks, maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks into everything. And so then they had me on 2 different types of drops. One was, I guess, an antibiotic, and one was something that was supposed to relieve the pressure that was there. But it was like milky and difficult to see out of.
You've been running 104 fever, except when you're in total ice pack immersion for weeks now at this point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So sorry. Go ahead.
There's so much. I don't even know where to go with stuff, Scott. We could talk about the fact that, okay, they decided that they were going to take a giant bunch of my blood, and really was explained to me what they were doing with the white blood cells. And then the next day they were going to inject all of that back in, which they did. It's pretty scary, because you don't know what they're doing. And it had like some isotopes that while they had it for 24 hours, basically, I guess it was tagged so that when I got in the scan machine,
that's what they did.
They could see where the white blood cells went to, so they could see where the infection was, what was going on with it. And they found nothing. when they did the scan. But there was also like a 48-hour snafu where they never came to get the blood. Then the scan wasn't available. Exactly. Um, and so anyhow, it finally happens, and it happens to be a day where I have a nurse that is completely incompetent and totally in the wrong profession. Um, and while I was in the machine, I had to the two people that were doing the test on me. I am spiking now. I can feel it. My temperature is going crazy. And they said, well, we need to go ahead and, it's not going to take that long. We need to go ahead and do the scan. Um, it really didn't. It probably took 35 minutes for them to do what they needed to do. They put me back in my wheelchair and left me right there by the CT scan machine. Only it was not an open side one. This one was actually an actual tube that I was in. It was a much different machine than the other scans that they had done. Well, and I guess I should have said, my nurse that morning didn't even know how to get me to the room to go. She didn't know where to go to take me. Um, and so I don't know, like a lesser person actually walked us there. She followed him there. Well, I got left there for over 2 hours with this blooming fever, not in the bed, but sitting in a wheelchair outside of the scan machine, but it's still inside of the room. And I'm crying. I'm asking the people, the technicians that did the scan, can you please call somebody? They're like, we've already told you your nurse is on her way. And I'm like, it only took us about 8 minutes to get here. So she's not on her way. Um, then I knew that I was going to have a bowel accident. And so I'm again begging them, and I'm in so much pain. My head is hurting, my fever is going, it's skyrocketing, and they keep telling me she's on her way. We've already called again, and they're on their way to get you. And after a little over 2 hours of me sitting there crying and moaning and um, pooping on myself, um, they sent somebody else finally to come and get me back to my room. Um, but I waited there for that long in a wheelchair. Anyhow,
You know what?
was
This
that was
is this. It sounds like something in the poorest parts of Africa, but at least there they have compassion. This thing at certain places is utterly lacking in compassion, basic humanity. And I know, again, people will discount that, but it's the truth. It has turned into something nightmarish. Um, and I remember this thing of them letting you just sit out in halls and stuff.
Mhm.
Anyway, so the the plasma the white blood cells didn't yield any information for them either, right?
Correct. Um, so the next thought is that maybe it's meningitis, and so they
Throw a dart, spin the wheel.
exactly, exactly. So they send two guys to my room to do a spinal tap. And my greatest fear is, I've been pooping in this bed. I've, lost my bladder in this bed. And I have had tons of people in and out, and not only in and out of my room, but in and out of other COVID patients' rooms. And I promise they're not putting shoe coverings on. Shoes where they've walked are getting walked into my room and everything too. And these guys are wanting to do a spinal tap. And I'm like, my room is not clean. It's not safe for this kind of thing to happen. And they're like, oh, it's really not a big deal. We're going to disinfect everything on your back, and everything is all covered. And so it's safe. It's absolutely safe. Well, it turns out that the doctor that is doing this spinal tap has never done one before,
Oh
but
dear God.
he's being coached by somebody that has,
Oh no,
and
you're
he's never
kidding.
done.
They're doing that medical training at your expense because it is a university hospital. This is his first time, and they're doing that using you as a guinea pig
That's absolutely
of
right.
all
And I
people.
said, yeah, I said, this, I'm a very compromised patient to begin with. Why I don't understand. And I'm laying there and, of course they did local stuff. They did injections that were supposed to numb it, but it was horrible. He didn't know where he was supposed to be putting um, the needle to extract the fluid. And anyhow, to the point that he's continuing to try and jabbing it around and doing all this different, you know, attempts. And I'm bawling. And I know that that's obvious, obviously I'm moving now. So that makes it even more dangerous for me as far as being paralyzed or whatever. And they finally, because he couldn't get any spinal fluid, he finally just said, okay, we're going to have to try again, or just accept the fact that you don't have enough fluid in there for us to find it, and
Yeah,
for
some
whatever
people are a
reason.
quart low on spinal fluid. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyhow, they left and I was completely traumatized, and took a while to stop crying from the whole experience. But I wasn't paralyzed at that, so I knew I had that to be thankful for. Um, then it was probably, I think it was 2 days later. I don't know. It all ran together with falling asleep for 8 or 9 hours at a time and not eating and stuff like that. Everything is a little blurry, but um, a day or two later, they asked me to an OR and had a doctor do a spinal tap, and
It was what?
it was easy. It was done. The prepping, the disinfecting me, tenting, and doing all of that stuff was the longest part of it. Um, but it
First of all,
done.
doing the spinal tap at all as if your problem was meningitis, that's a whole other issue. The sanitary conditions of doing a spinal, just exactly what you said, of not getting you someplace else to try and do a spinal tap. I had a simple injection. They gave, I don't know, antibiotic and steroids and stuff when I went into the doctor in a parking lot. In a parking lot, and the girl who did it, to describe the process and the her not taking sanitary precautions, nobody would believe me if I told you. You'd say, oh, no nurse would do that. I've got this thing on my hip. I'm beginning to worry now that I've got, I could have staph or something because of the unsanitary conditions. And they scoff at you if you complain, but trying to give you that spinal tap in that situation is unconscionable. People should lose licenses over it. Using someone who's never done a spinal tap before on you, I understand they have to be trained. Pick someone else. Don't do that to you in the condition that you're in. And yet they
That
did. Yeah.
That's exactly what I said to them, but I didn't say it till after the fact. When I had a doctor in my room, I mean, I was crying. Sure, I was crying, and I expressed my worry about it being in my room in the first place. But until he started doing the attempting to do the spinal tap, being coached by the other doctor, I had no idea he'd never done one before.
Well,
Because
I
I
was
actually asks, so have you done one of these before? No, this is my first one.
I was in there one time. I almost hate to mention this, but people need to understand what's going on. I was in there one time because I had it was a kidney thing, and they break you down because you're afraid if you say no, they're going to go, well, if you don't want medical treatment, if you want to refuse us, fine, we'll cut you off. I'm going to go ahead and say it. They were bringing around trainees, and it turns out it was a uric acid blockage, It's all it was, but my kidney numbers were off the charts. Things were bad. In 2 days, I had 5 digital prostate exams. Five. And we know how unpleasant those are. I had 5 by people who were saying, this is the first time I've ever done one of these. 5 in 2 days. It had nothing to do with what they're using us for their training purposes. And once you're in there, you're scared to say no, because I mean, I'm thinking there are people thinking my kidneys are going to shut down and I'll be without, on dialysis forever. And so you sit there and submit to these outrageous things. And I'm going through this because people need to understand the ones who find themselves in this situation, you have to stand up and say no. You have to. And it's hard. But anyway, okay, so go ahead. So now they've got your spinal tap. You don't have meningitis. But you're still in here, and you did wind up getting out. Let's talk about, how'd you finally get out?
Um, I was desperate to get back home. They all knew that I was a single mom and that my daughter was here at the house. And I actually went just a little bit over a day without any fever at all, but my fever came back and they went ahead and released me anyway with the commitment for me that if my fever came back or if I started getting worse, that I would come back. So I was home for about like 3.5 days. And my oxygen levels started to drop, which during the hospital visit, my oxygen would always go between 93 and 97 or 98. It had never dropped below 93 in the hospital. Well, when I was home, the day that I went, it was down to 89, and I was scared because I'm thinking, okay, well now it's going to start to turn where it's in my lungs really bad.
Yeah.
And it was not respiratory. I guess I should have said that a long time ago. That was one of the things, yes, I had a cough. Yes, I was coughing stuff. But it was not ever where I had to be put on oxygen or anything like that the whole time that I was in there. And that was part of their reasoning for thinking that it was everything in the world other than COVID, because I was presenting differently. And that was part of their whole, yeah, it's not COVID at all. It's got to be something else because she's not having all the respiratory issues. And anyhow, the whole more than 24 hours that it took for me to be taken from the emergency room this time, that was the absolute worst part of all of it, was being in there on a bed that's basically much smaller than me, even, or barely, I have like an inch on each side of me. My fever's off the charts, my headache is off the charts, my oxygen is down, and I'm in this room that has no bathroom. They finally, after like 4.5 hours, they finally brought a bedside commode in there. And, I'm having BMs like crazy, having diarrhea, and I'm pushing the button telling these people that are taking care of me in the ER the second time or third time around that I needed to have my bedside commode taken care of. I was told by the girl that answered the button, that's not an emergency and they'll get to it whenever they can. Just another unimaginable gross thing to have to be there when you've got poop, a foot and a half from your head. I also, during that time, I think I went almost 8 hours without any water and
No, 8 hours.
without any water in the emergency room. And finally, a doctor because they didn't know if they were going to have to do some kind of surgery on me. So they weren't letting me have water or anything. Finally, a doctor that had taken care of me during the first 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks that I was there, she came to see me, and they had all switched to different things there at the hospital. So she's in the ER now and not up on the COVID floor. And she's like, yes, you can have food, and yes, you can have water. We're not going to have to do any kind of surgery. We're just waiting for a room for you. And so she was absolutely astounded at the fact that I hadn't been allowed to have anything at all to drink. I did not have any IV. I had not been given any pain medicine, no Tylenol, no, nothing, obviously, because I couldn't drink anything because I couldn't take a pill, to drink anything. Um, and the little girl, whatever, the disrespectful girl that was answering the nurse call button that whole time, more than 24 hours that I was ER, she was absolutely horrible. And I know that she didn't say anything to the nurse the different times when I was calling, saying that fever was getting worse and that I needed to have my bedside commode taken care of. And anyhow, it was terrible. And being on a mattress that was about this thick for more than 24 hours when your whole body is absolutely hurting so bad from the fever and just everything it's been through.
People who haven't had it can't understand how bad this feels. And the bed that you're on, that's like this, is like a torture device. Your arms have no. I mean, you've got to
Yeah.
to line up, and you're laying there. And we finally hear about this, and they've left you there for this prolonged period of time. Now, I will tell you, some influential people got involved.
Mhm.
And they got you a room. It was always possible to have gotten you a room because they did, but it took
Exactly.
it took some other people who brought some pressure to bear, and suddenly they were able to find you a room. So you had that, and we have said enough that if people are not wise now to some of the stuff in the medical system, they're not going to be. I want to mention that from early on, from pretty far back, I know your situation, and I told Mary, tell her to insist on plasma treatment. Just get plasma treatment, and we couldn't tell, but you had asked, right?
Oh, from the very beginning, probably starting about day 3, and all of this, when it kind of coincided with everything that was going on with Trump, with President Trump. So
Absolutely.
you're hearing about everything that, remdesivir, that all of the different drugs, the different things that they did for him. And I actually had a male nurse that said, he's the president of the United States, and you don't get the same treatment as the president of the United States for obvious reasons. I'm like, I totally get that. But y'all have ignored every request that I've had, for any types of drugs
So
or anything that's
plasma
been proven to help.
plasma, they take plasma from people who have had COVID and recovered and have antibodies. And I that there's not enough to go around, but there's enough for certain situations. There is, and they're not using it. Far too often they're not using it. They weren't then. And I had told Mary, look, and several times, tell her to insist. You were a prime candidate for it. And so you were asking for it and you're not getting it. And so you're in here. This is now, and the other thing that at least should be, is they keep trying to take the position that this is not COVID. COVID is not your problem. And they're doing all these other things. They are ignoring science. Not only is this not science, this is the opposite of science. And I'm sort of a stickler for that. You know, there's a scientific method, and you don't throw out things because they don't support what you want to believe. You look at what's there and you deal with the facts. And they're not doing that at every turn. They're ignoring science when they deal with you. And so you're in here this last time, and things are once again not well. And I'm only doing this because we can just beat this medical system up for the next day. You wound up finally. They gave you plasma.
Mhm. Finally, there was a doctor that I kind of was able to bond with that I had for a I would probably about 8 days or so, maybe the entire second visit to the hospital, and, he finally said, "Okay, we are out of things, you know, aside from just releasing you and saying you have a fever of unknown origin, we're out of things that we can test you for. So I'm gonna see what I can do about getting plasma for you." And once they got it, they, you know, they typed my blood thing. Once they administered it, within 24 hours, I felt better and I did not have a single fever after they administered the plasma
24 hours.
within 24 hours. Yeah.
It would have done that for you at any
Obviously,
point.
I was still weak. Go ahead.
Oh, you just cut there. Obviously, you were what?
Um, no, you go ahead. Say what you were going to
Oh,
say.
I said it would have done that for you at any point along the way.
Mhm.
Anyone listening, understand it would have done that for you at any point along the way. Your body, this whole idea that you got over it, you got it again, all this stuff, your body was not making antibodies. Probably because of your situation, the chemo, a lot of those things are immunosuppressants. I don't know about yours, but there's a good chance. There's all kinds of reasons, but maybe just the weakened condition. You weren't producing antibodies. The moment you got antibodies, you got well.
That's correct. And the interesting thing also with that, Scott, is when I had my when I had my negative test, my very first negative test in August, I asked them to do the antibody test. Also, I had them do the antibody test again when I tested negative. I never ever produced any antibodies at
Yep.
all. And they knew that. So again, I'm like, you know, I'm not a doctor, but if I didn't produce antibodies, or if you can't, you know, chemo killed everything, whatever it did, wouldn't you put two and two together and administer something that would help me and give me the
A
antibodies?
scientist would do that. So you mentioned sepsis a while ago. They were thinking sepsis. Do you know what sepsis is?
Absolutely. I've been hospitalized for it a number of times because of my urological issues that I've had, because when I'm in chemo, my body produces kidney stones like crazy. In 1 year going through chemo, I had to have 6 kidney stone surgeries. So yes. Um,
Within the context of COVID, people use words a lot of ways. So I'm going to go through something for the other people. But when you get an infection, when your body is attacked, it sends out these things called cytokine. I think technically it's cytokine. Cyto means cell, and the kine comes from the same root as kinetic, which means motion. So these are cells in motion, and they send out, it's part of your immune system. There are other types of cytokines, but your body sends out as part of an immune system to go attack whatever's attacking you. Under certain conditions, your body can be sort of tricked into producing maybe 100 times too many of these cells. And it's what's known as a cytokine storm, all right? And there's so much of this stuff flooding through you. And remember, these are cells that are designed to attack. They wind up attacking your own organs. And that's a condition known as sepsis. And you hear about healthy young people who go into the hospital for something, and the next thing we hear is, well, their organs are shutting down. Their organs are just shutting down. It's a cascade of organs shut down, and they die. And we don't understand why. They were young and healthy. It's cytokine storm. And these killer cells begin to attack your own organs. And the problem with it is once you get into cytokine storm, it's very, very difficult to stop. The reason hydroxychloroquine started being used is in malaria patients. Malaria is a painful, horrible disease, but sometimes it kills. And what they discovered was that most of the time that it kills, it appears to be because it triggers cytokine storm. The people who die from malaria go into sepsis due to cytokine storm. And so they believed that, well, they know that the chloroquine helps prevent that, helps reduce the possibility of it. It's not a thing to be given once you're in that shape, because once you get to that point, it's hard to arrest. Some people live through it, a bunch don't. I'm convinced that there was a point there, that's the condition you were in. It's a miracle that you lived through it. And you not having the lungs, I've been able to feel this thing attack my lungs, and it doesn't feel like anything. It's not like flu. It's weird. I can feel it. But you were in a condition, when they say sepsis, I think you had cytokine storm going on, and you miraculously were able to push through that. Your body didn't shut all the way down. And they did everything wrong along the way. I look back at it, it's amazing. You did not get over it, and the test meant nothing. You had it the whole time. You weren't developing antibodies. And again, it's amazing that it didn't escalate more than it did. And eventually, after all this nightmare, they gave you the plasma therapy, they gave you the antibodies, and in less than 24 hours, you're better. Within days of that, you went shopping. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you were, I don't want to rat you out, but you did, and you felt good. You had felt more horrible than probably anybody who listening to this will ever feel. And within 24 hours, you felt good. The cure was.
I was weak. And, it took probably a week before I could walk from one end of the house to the other without feeling like I was going to fall down or pass out. Sure. But comparatively speaking, when you're knocking on death's door and then you get this plasma, and I'm like, wow, the doctors came in and I'm like, I feel good. I want to go home.
You knew you were okay. And that's the thing.
I
have said that, and I think the ivermectin had a lot to do with it. But if you had asked me 2 weeks ago what it would be to feel like this, I would have said, oh, well, this is not very good. But compared to where I've been, I feel amazing. And I also know suddenly I'm okay. I didn't know that, a couple of days before. So you got the antibodies, you got the plasma, and it fixed things. And you were on a path, you were on a course where nothing is getting better, nothing. And you have no hope that it's ever going to. You're sitting there thinking, I'm just going to continue to deteriorate until I die, weren't you?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I was very, very scared that, I wasn't going to get to see my daughter again. And, I was. There were a couple of nights that were the worst, that I actually was almost praying that it would be over because I couldn't handle it. And I know that I had a pretty big breakdown one morning when I had a doctor's in the office in my room. And I told him, I don't want to ever feel like that again. You guys have got to figure something out because I don't want to be praying that God take me. I have a child y'all have to figure something out because what you're doing now is not working.
I understand it. I don't understand. I can't explain to people what this does to your brain, your will. There were times, Cheryl, and I told Mary, I just want to escape my body. I wasn't saying I want to die. I just want to be able to check out, sit in the corner, and watch until this goes. I can't stand to be in this right now. Your whole body feels wrong, and if you haven't had it, you won't understand it. But it just takes your will.
Well, it absolutely does. And I like to talk a little bit about my oncologist also, how he was trying to visit me and wasn't able to visit me. And when I went in last week or I'm sorry, 2 weeks ago for chemo, um, he was crying. He was crying and because he thought he was going to lose me as well. And he didn't have any explanation about all the awful stuff that they put me through. And he could felt that they were treating me just completely like a guinea pig.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I basically had zero value to them except as a test monkey or whatever however you want to look at it.
That's a fact.
A lab rat. And anyhow, we went through everything, talked through all of it because obviously everything went haywire after the chemo in September. And he talked to the infectious disease doctor, and they both felt strongly that if chemo were to reactivate it again in my body, that they knew exactly what they needed to do. He would direct admit me and he would get plasma immediately. So that's the bottom line for everybody that it gets sick is, plasma. You got to get the plasma, but then also for everybody that's recovered, please consider giving your plasma because it will save lives. It saved my life.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Your people need to, I want to be sure they understand what you just said. Your oncologist, who has given you incredible treatment, is a good person, was unable to come see you.
That's correct.
Once you're behind the walls of the COVID system, you're lost to the rest of the people. They own you. And you need to understand that. If you don't have someone who can advocate, if you're not in a place where they'll let your doctor see you, you're in trouble. You're at risk. And they have these, I've just learned now, this position in hospitals now called a hospitalist. And the best we can understand, these are people who have failed in private practice. You do know that somewhere in the world is the world's worst doctor. That person exists. He or she, if you could rank them all, somewhere there's the worst, and they're practicing right now, right? Can't get around it. So, you want to go the bottom 2%, they're hospitalists. And they're in charge of your fate while they've created these new positions. And if you fall under the clutches of the hospitalist, you're in trouble. You need to have a doctor of your own who admits you someplace where they're going to have access to you. If you get in behind the walls and you're under the authority of a hospitalist, you're already in trouble. Check out, try again someplace else. We've gone on a long time, and I hope, but I want to get one last thing in. Hydroxychloroquine, they won't talk about it because of politics. It's not a cure-all, but it's a thing that prevents a lot of people from going into cytokine storm and dying. And they won't, and it's a thing to be given early, and they aren't doing it because of politics. Ivermectin, I've talked about, you can call it coincidence if you want, but I was in horrible, horrible shape. And someone brought me ivermectin from Mexico. They gave me theirs. And within 48 hours, 2 doses, I all of a sudden the thing broke, and I've never felt that same level of, bad again. Not even, and here I am now. I've got all 4 doses, and I'm doing good. You can call it coincidence or not. Ivermectin has antiviral properties, and I got better. And this medical system will say that's not scientific. This is not, that's anecdotal. Well, I'll take anecdotal. I'm better. They won't talk about ivermectin because A, politics, that's a big part of it, and B, because it's this nearly free drug. There's no money in it, and the people who should be involved won't because there's no money in it. The plasma, I'm glad you mentioned the comment that guy made, because it's political. They're letting people die. That's a strong statement. I'm going to say it, and I know what I'm talking about. They are letting people die because of politics. And even the ones who don't die, like you, I'm going to tell you, you defy all logic. The people who don't believe in God, that don't believe in prayer, I challenge them. If you know anything about science, step through what you went through and how deep you were into it. You defy all logic. You should not have lived through what you went through. I'm convinced you went into the cytokine storm. I'm convinced you went through sepsis. And in your condition with the chemo and everything else, people don't live through that. They're not living through it. And then you went back through the whole thing and all of the other stuff you went through to make it to the point where you finally got the plasma was a miracle. But you can see that the cure for you, the fix for you, had been there all along. They could have given it to you, and any medical practitioner should have looked at the entirety of your case and said, well, if there's ever a time to give plasma, this is it. If you weren't a case for it, I don't know when you would ever use it. And they refused to do it. They didn't overlook it because you demanded it. They refused to do it. And you see what it did for you. Everyone who watches this, and it's a compelling story. You, as I said at the beginning, have got the most nightmarish, worst COVID story of anyone we've heard of who survived. So there's a lot of information here, and I hopefully people who worry that they've gotten it, they have a relative, there's some information in here that might help them. I think you've done a good thing. Maybe there's a purpose served by what you went through.
Well, I can't thank you and Mary and the Sunday school class enough. That all of your prayer, like you said, that is definitely a big part of it. That the one doctor that really seemed to care, y'all's prayer brought him to me, and for him to act on it, it's y'all's prayer that got me through. So
it's good to have you back.
I'm forever indebted. So
it's good to have you back.
Yes, and it's really good to be back.
We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Okay. Love you, Scott.
You too.